I want to start with something that should bother anyone who has watched the first season of Vikings and been honest with themselves afterward. Over the course of those early episodes, the men we are following rob a monastery full of people who cannot fight back, sail home to sacrifice a human being at a temple, and spend most of their spare time threatening to kill each other over wounded pride. By the end of it, I was completely on their side, hoping a crew of raiders would make it home safe and go do it all again. The strange part is that a good amount of what pulled me onto their side is real. The show reaches into actual history, pulls out the pieces that happen to be true, and uses them to make me forgive people I would have been terrified of if I had met them on a beach in the year 793. That is the trick I want to pull apart, because it is a real trick and the show is very good at it. There is a difference between what a show gets right by accident and what a show gets right on purpose. And once you start watching Vikings with that difference in mind, the first season stops looking like a history lesson and starts looking like a defense lawyer building a case. Everything it gets right, and everything it quietly changes, pushes in the same direction, toward keeping these men likable. So the best place to start is the raid the whole show is built on. In the first season, Ragnar sails west and attacks the monastery at Lindisfarne, and almost everything about how that raid is set up is accurate. Lindisfarne was a real island monastery off the coast of Northumbria, one of the most sacred sites in Christian Britain, and in the year 793 it was attacked by Norse raiders more or less out of nowhere. It was a perfect target for a brutal reason. The monks had gold, silver, and holy relics sitting in an unguarded building, because no one in Christian Europe had ever imagined that an attack could come from the sea. The raid was so shocking that the clearest surviving account of it was written by a horrified Northumbrian scholar named Alcuin, who was living hundreds of miles away at the court of Charlemagne when the news reached him. He wrote that heathens had trampled the bodies of the saints in the temple of God like dung in the street. That is the event the show hands you in its opening stretch, and it hands it to you straight. Here is where the choice starts to show. The show keeps every bit of the horror, the defenseless monks, the slaughter, the looting of a holy place, and then it threads one invented character through the middle of it. Ragnar finds a young monk named Athelstan hiding among the books and decides not to kill him. He takes him home instead, curious about him, almost gentle with him. So the very first thing I watch these men do is something monstrous, and before the episode is even over, the show has given me a reason to see the man leading them as thoughtful, curious, a cut above the killers around him. The massacre stays ugly. Ragnar walks out of it looking like the one person on that beach worth following. The show is just as honest about why these men raid in the first place, and that honesty does more work than you would expect. Vikings does not pretend its raiders are cartoon monsters who kill for fun. It shows you a cold country with too little good farmland, a world where a man's worth is measured in what he can carry home, and a religion that promises a place in Valhalla to anyone who dies well with a weapon in his hand. All of that is real. Norse raiding grew out of exactly that mix of hard land, hunger for silver, and a faith that made a violent death honorable rather than shameful. And once I understand why a man is doing something, I start forgiving him for it almost automatically. A motive I can follow is a motive I can excuse. The show knows this, and it gives these men motives I can follow every single time they do something terrible. The sacrifice is where the show's confidence gets interesting, because this is the point where it reaches for the most disturbing thing it can find and presents it as solemn truth. In the 8th episode, the characters travel to the great temple at Uppsala to make offerings to the gods, and the sequence includes human sacrifice, carried with the same weight as any act of worship. That whole picture is lifted almost directly from a real medieval source. An 11th century churchman named Adam of Bremen described a temple at Uppsala where, every 9 years, the Norse would sacrifice 9 males of every living creature, including men, and hang the bodies in a sacred grove beside the temple. The show recreates that grove. It uses the real account almost line for line. What the show does not tell you is who was holding the pen. Adam of Bremen was a Christian bishop's man writing about pagans he wanted his readers to see as savages, and he never witnessed any of it himself. When archaeologists went looking for that famous temple at Uppsala, they never found it. What they found was the outline of a great royal hall, which is a very different thing from a house of 9-year blood rituals. Historians have been arguing about how much of Adam's account was true for a long time, and plenty of them think he exaggerated it badly or invented parts of it wholesale. The honest complication is that human sacrifice among the Norse was real, even if Adam's particular version was dressed up for effect. At a site called Trelleborg in Denmark, archaeologists found human remains dropped into wells, including 4 children between the ages of 4 and 7, alongside animal bones and offerings. So, the practice existed. What the show does is take the single most lurid description available, one written by a hostile outsider, treat it as documentary fact, and then frame the result as sincere faith instead of horror. Even the sacrifice gets folded into the same effect as everything else. I watched these men kill someone at an altar and come away understanding them a little better, which is a strange thing for a scene of human sacrifice to pull off. Everything so far is history. The show gets mostly right. The next few pieces are history. The show bends, and the way it bends them gives the game away. Take the shield-maidens. Lagertha is one of the most beloved characters in the show, a warrior who fights beside the men and answers to no one, and the first season treats female warriors as an ordinary, accepted part of this world. The real history is far shakier than that. Lagertha herself comes from a book written by a Danish historian named Saxo Grammaticus in the 12th century, roughly 300 years after the events it describes, which is a little like writing the definitive account of a specific person from the early 1700s today and expecting every detail to hold up. The hard archaeological evidence for women fighters comes down mostly to a single grave in Birka, Sweden, where a body buried with weapons, 2 horses, and a set of wargame pieces turned out, after DNA testing, to be female. That grave is real, and it is genuinely striking. And it is also nowhere near as settled as the show makes female warriors look. Serious historians still argue about whether the weapons meant she fought or meant something else about her rank. And one grave, however remarkable, does not prove that armed women were a common sight. The show takes that genuine maybe and presents it as everyday fact. Lagertha earns her place in the story by making this world feel fairer and more open than it really was, giving me someone to admire whose strength has nothing to do with robbing defenseless monks. She works beautifully. She is also the clearest sign that the show will lean on history when history helps and let go of it the moment something more likable is within reach. The sunstone is a smaller version of the same move. At one point, the Vikings navigate the open sea using a crystal held up to the sky, a sunstone that lets them find the sun's position even through heavy cloud. It is a wonderful little moment of competence, and the evidence for it is thin. The sunstone shows up in a handful of Norse sagas, but those were written down in the 13th century, more than 150 years after the Viking Age had ended. No one has ever dug a confirmed sunstone out of a Viking grave or a Viking ship. The one real crystal often waved around as proof came off an English warship that sank in 1592, which is a long way from a longship. Modern physicists have shown that the right kind of crystal genuinely could locate the sun through cloud, so the idea holds together as something the Vikings might plausibly have done. The show presents it as something they definitely did, and hands the trick to Floki, because a crew that can find its way across the North Atlantic by reading light through a stone is a crew I admire rather than fear. The shield-maidens and the sunstone are real history pulled out of shape. The last 3 pieces were never real to begin with, and they show the show's hand more plainly than anything else. Start with the place itself. Kattegat, the home port I spend the whole series growing attached to, the town where so much of the show lives and breathes, was never a real Viking town. There is a real Kattegat, but it is a stretch of open water between Denmark and Sweden, a sea passage, never a settlement full of longhouses and market stalls. The show needed somewhere for me to belong, a home to come back to between raids, so it built one and gave it a real-sounding name. The name is borrowed. The town is set dressing. The same goes for the villain of the first season. Earl Haraldson, the older, colder ruler who stands in Ragnar's way through those early episodes, the man Ragnar finally has to kill to rise, has no basis in history at all. There was no such Earl. He was written for the show, and his job is structural. He gives Ragnar a tyrant to stand against, an oppressor to overthrow, so that a man who helped slaughter a monastery full of unarmed monks can still register in my head as the underdog. Put a raider beside a worse man who rules over him, and the raider starts to look like the hero of the story. That is the entire reason Haraldson exists. Which brings me to the biggest invention of all, the one the whole show is named after. Ragnar Lothbrok himself almost certainly never existed as a single real man. There probably were 1 or 2 real Norse warlords whose deeds fed into the legend, a raider recorded as attacking Paris, another name or 2 attached to real campaigns. But the Ragnar of the sagas, the great hero who did everything from sacking cities to dying in a pit of snakes, was most likely stitched together by storytellers centuries after the fact out of several different men's lives. The clearest evidence for this is a strange one. Ragnar's sons were real. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan. These were genuine historical figures who led a very real invasion of England in the 860s. The part that only surfaces in the later legends is the idea that they were all the sons of one famous father named Ragnar. The men were real. The father who ties them together looks invented. The comparison I keep coming back to is King Arthur, a figure who may have a few threads of real history buried somewhere underneath, wrapped in so much myth that the real man, if he was ever one man at all, is gone for good. That is what Ragnar is. And it means the show did to its own title character exactly what it did to the monastery, the sacrifice, the shield-maidens, and the town. It found a scrap of something real or something half-real, and it built the most compelling possible version on top of that scrap. The whole series rests on a man who is mostly a story we told ourselves about the Vikings, which is a fitting foundation for a show that is itself a story we tell ourselves about the Vikings. So here is the case, now that all the pieces are on the table. It would be easy to assume a show makes its heroes likable by hiding the ugly things they do, cleaning them up, and looking away from the blood. Vikings does the opposite, and that is what makes it so effective. It does not hide the violence anywhere. The raid on Lindisfarne is brutal. The sacrifice is real, and it is disturbing. The pride that drives these men to threaten and kill each other is deadly, and the show never softens it. The ugliness is all there, in full view. What the show does instead is surround that ugliness with just enough verified history that these men stop feeling like strangers to me. The real raid, the real motives, the real sacrifice pulled from a real manuscript, all of it works to make the world solid and believable. And a believable man is a man I start to know. Once I know him, once I understand why he does what he does and recognize the real world he moves through, I stop flinching at him. The accuracy is the anesthetic. The more real the show feels, the less its violence lands as violence, and the more it lands as the understandable behavior of people I have come to like. Every true detail lowers my guard a little further. The strange conclusion I keep landing on is that Vikings is more honest about Viking brutality than most people give it credit for, and that honesty is the exact thing that lets it get away with everything. A show that lied about the violence would be easy to resist. I would see the cleanup and push back against it. This show tells me something close to the truth about who these men were and what they did, and that truth is precisely what disarms me. I finished the first season feeling like I have watched something real, and I have. The raids happened, the sacrifices happened, the hard, hungry, violent world was real. I have also just spent hours cheering for a crew of men that the actual monks of Lindisfarne, the ones whose bodies got trampled like dung in the street, would have recognized on sight as the end of their world. The show showed me those men honestly, and I liked them anyway. I never once wanted to look away. If you want to know how good historical fiction actually works, that is the whole answer. Tell people enough of the truth and they forget to judge the rest.